Hello, everybody, and welcome to Backfired, an NBA history podcast about bad teams, bad luck, and bad decisions. My name is Lewis, and today I'm going to talk about a certain trade that did a lot of damage to my favorite team, the Memphis Grizzlies, and it involves the 2003 draft, involves the impact of decisions years down the road, the impact of decisions somebody else made, and one of my favorite things to talk about on this show, bad luck. But before I get into that, I do have a cool announcement. My friend Brooks made a website for this show. It both mirrors the podcast feed and gives me a place where I can do some writing. So check that out if you'd like. It's just backfirednba.com. There's a link in the description of this episode. So I'm slowly adapting podcast episodes into article form and also writing about just whatever comes to mind for me. I've already written about Santi Aldama's proclivity for reverse dunks and about Nick Richards' mini breakout on the Charlotte Hornets this year. I also, every once in a while, like to convert the NBA standings into a soccer table just to see how a given team looks when you look at their record in a slightly different light. So I posted a tutorial on how to do that in the programming language R, which is my preferred language. So check those out if you'd like. I'd really appreciate it. My friend worked very hard on it. On that website, I'll also be posting some more of my code that I've written for various NBA projects on there. But anyway, let's first start with some background for the trade that I'm talking about. So it's the year 1997, and Stu Jackson, who's the president and general manager of the Vancouver Grizzlies, is starting to feel a little bit of pressure. So the Grizzlies, for the first 2 years that they played in the NBA, the 96 and the 97 season, they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They lost a lot of games, and they collected a little bit of talent along the way with their high draft picks. So in their 3 lottery picks up to that point, they had selected Bryant Big Country Reeves, who was not always bad. He was the 6th pick in the 1995 draft. Sharif Abdur-Rahim, who is the best player the Vancouver Grizzlies ever had. He was the 3rd pick. And then they were just about to pick Antonio Daniels with the 4th pick in the 97 draft because they needed a point guard. Now, Daniels would not end up being a good player for the Grizzlies, but they let their incumbent starting point guard Greg Anthony walk in free agency. So they were really invested in their bet that Antonio Daniels was going to be the guy. So they had a center in Reeves that showed a lot of promise. He was coming off of a really good second half of his second season. They have a small forward in Sharif Abdur-Rahim, who is very obviously a good player. And then they had who they thought was a franchise point guard in Daniels. And they had a few shooting guards. Anthony Peeler was the most talented one, although he would demand a trade and sit out most of this upcoming season, the 97-98 season. But Stu Jackson felt for the time being that the shooting guard position was good enough that they could go out and target their weakest position, which was power forward. And this would become a theme in Vancouver. For the next few years, Jackson acquired several power forwards, mostly in the same mold. Defense first, veteran player who could hustle, dive on the floor for loose balls, and particularly fix their rebounding problems because they were a bottom 3 rebounding team in their first season on both ends. And then in their second season, they had the worst defensive rebounding rate in the league and the 20th best offensive rebounding rate. Big Country really was not a great rebounder ever in his career. He was coming off a season where he averaged a career-high 8 rebounds per game. But as I mentioned in episode 26 of this show about scorekeeper bias and Nick Van Exel, the Vancouver Grizzlies scorekeeper openly admitted to artificially inflating Big Country's rebound numbers. So I'm sure the coaching staff and the front office were aware that Reeves needed some help on that end. Now, what the Grizzlies did was they made a trade for a guy named Otis Thorpe. Who is Otis Thorpe, you may ask? If you're not a fan of the Houston Rockets or the Detroit Pistons, you may not know Otis Thorpe. Well, he was a pretty good power forward back in his day. He played for the Kansas City Kings. That's how long ago this guy was doing his thing. His rookie season was the Sacramento Kings' final year in Kansas City. He then played 3 more seasons in Sacramento, including 1 season where he averaged 20 points and 10 rebounds before getting traded to the Houston Rockets. Thorpe played in Houston for parts of 7 seasons, was named an All-Star in 1992. He and Hakeem Olajuwon were a pretty good 1-2 punch on both ends of the floor. Although the Rockets did not make the playoffs the 1 year that Thorpe was named an All-Star, he still was very good in the other years. Another notable thing about Thorpe is that from his 3rd season in the league until he was traded from Houston, he basically played every single game and started almost every single game that he played. He was the NBA Iron Man for a while there. So much so that there was a New York Times article when he sustained an injury in the preseason that announced the end of his Iron Man streak that reads, quote, "The reign of forward Otis Thorpe as the current Iron Man of the National Basketball Association will come to an end because of a kidney injury the Houston Rockets player suffered in an exhibition game last week in Detroit. Thorpe has played in 542 consecutive games and has started the last 493 of them, both streaks the longest among active NBA players. But Thorpe, who was injured when the Pistons' Isaiah Thomas inadvertently kneed him in the stomach, is expected to be out for at least 4 weeks because of a blood buildup in the wall of one of his kidneys. Doctors have told him to avoid strenuous activity." Now, when he came back, he played every game for the rest of the season, then played all 82 the next year, 1994, which was the year that he won a championship with the Rockets, and he started all 23 of the Rockets' playoff games at power forward. But then he was traded mid-season before he could repeat as champion in 1995. So the Rockets traded Thorpe at the deadline to the Portland Trail Blazers to reunite Hakeem Olajuwon with his fellow Houston Cougar, Clyde Drexler, who had requested a trade twice that season and finally got his wish. And this trade was extremely unpopular in Houston for a while. They started off, I believe, 6-7 after that trade, and it was not a fait accompli that they would repeat as champions in 1995. Now, Thorpe was extremely unhappy to be dealt to Portland, and Portland was swept in the first round by the Phoenix Suns while his former Rocket teammates got to win another championship. So he was pretty happy to be traded to the Detroit Pistons just a few months later. The Pistons had not been good for a couple years, but they had a new coach in Doug Collins and a budding superstar in Grant Hill. But after 2 seasons in Detroit, Thorpe had had enough of Doug Collins. Both of them were described as being very intense, and they just didn't mix well together. They argued during huddles, ignored each other during practices. Mitch Albom of the Detroit Free Press, also the guy who wrote Tuesdays with Morrie and The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, he wrote that Thorpe and Collins were oil and water, and that Collins was also beefing with another power forward, Grant Long, over playing time. So things just were not going well for Collins. Collins actually was fired midway through the next year. And after the Pistons went 54-28, they were thought of as a great success for the first 2 years of Collins' tenure, but then they lost in the first round to the Atlanta Hawks. And after that playoff series, Thorpe demanded a trade, wanting to go to a true championship contender because Detroit just wasn't it. So the Pistons began searching for trades, and the Vancouver Grizzlies came knocking on the door, offering a protected first-round pick in exchange for Otis Thorpe. Now, the Pistons leapt at this opportunity. It's not every day that an expansion team is looking to shed first-round picks. And even with it being pretty heavily protected, the odds were that the Vancouver Grizzlies were not going to be good anytime soon. So the Pistons agreed to this instantly. Now, the pick protections were as follows. So this trade occurred in August of 1997. For the 1998 draft through the 2002 draft, the next 5 drafts, the pick was protected 2 through 18. So the Pistons would only get the pick if the Grizzlies won the draft lottery or made the playoffs by a pretty convincing margin, like if they were essentially a home court advantage team. But in 2003, that pick was top 1 protected. So if the pick made it all the way to 2003 without being conveyed to Detroit, the Grizzlies would have to win the draft lottery to keep their pick, and otherwise the pick would convey to Detroit in 2003. Now, the pick had to convey by 2004, I believe because of the so-called 7-year rule, which states that an NBA team can only trade picks up to 7 years in advance. 7-year rule is why the Lakers' 2029 pick became available this season and has been talked about a million times a day all season. But what that meant was that if somehow the Grizzlies kept their pick for the next 5 years, then also won the draft lottery in the 6th year, the Pistons would receive an unprotected first rounder in 2004. And the Pistons were willing to take that gamble, 1, because Thorpe was a malcontent, and 2, because it opened up cap space for them to re-sign Lindsey Hunter and to sign Bison Dele away from the Chicago Bulls. And 3rd, it's just another lottery ticket to hold on to. Now, from the Grizzlies' side, Stu Jackson was willing to take that gamble as well because he was banking on Daniels being the right point guard for the team and Thorpe being a model citizen, a veteran leader, defensive anchor, and rebounder like he had been in Houston. I wouldn't say that he was the defensive anchor in Houston alongside Hakeem Olajuwon, but you get what I'm saying. Stu was banking on sending Detroit, let's say like the 20th pick in 1999 because he was banking on that trade and his lottery pick of Daniels both hitting. Now, we know in hindsight, this did not happen. It was a horrible move, but to everybody but Stu, it also looked like a bad move in the moment. Thorpe instantly demanded a trade. He wanted to fail to report, skip his physical, all that stuff, but his agent decided that the best way to go about things was to honor his contract, play for the Grizzlies, all the while pressing Stu Jackson to trade him to a contender as soon as possible. But what's worse is because of the Stepien rule, go back to episode 4 of this show if you aren't familiar with the origin of the Stepien rule, but that rule prevented NBA teams from going more than one consecutive year without a first-round pick. And in the event that there was any uncertainty, for example, if a protected pick that was outstanding to another team, outside of on draft night, the team couldn't trade any other future first-round picks until that pick's year became certain or, unless they acquired another first-round pick. So in like 1998, let's say, the Grizzlies couldn't trade their 2001 first-round pick because that may be the year, that the pick in the Otis Thorpe trade conveyed. So it really restricted what the Grizzlies could do moving forward for a little while there. But on the court, it was a disaster as well. The Grizzlies actually had a really good start to the year, relatively speaking. They were 6-7 in their first 13 games, which for Vancouver, pretty damn good. But Thorpe was mailing it in the whole time. He again got into arguments with the coaching staff, pressured the coach, Brian Hill, to bench rookie point guard Antonio Daniels, who was willing to come off the bench if that would win them more games, but Hill and Jackson really both needed Antonio Daniels to be the starter so that he could develop into the player they, were quickly realizing that he probably wouldn't become. All the while, Thorpe was demanding again and again to be traded, and finally at the trade deadline, he got his wish. He was sent back to Sacramento, who was not that much better than the Grizzlies were, but Thorpe got out of Vancouver like he wanted. The Grizzlies in return received Michael Smith, who was pretty good young rebounder and defender out of Providence. Oh, actually, now that I think of it, Otis Thorpe also went to Providence. That's kind of funny. But then they also received Bobby Hurley, who was injured in a car crash in his rookie season and never became the player that he could have been, unfortunately. Bobby Hurley, of course, incredible college point guard, one of the best ever. But because the Grizzlies had to move on from Thorpe so quickly, in essence, the return for their heavily protected first-round pick was Smith and Hurley, which is a deal that nobody would have made. Hurley only played for the rest of that season and then had to retire. Michael Smith was, not a veteran leader. So really the trade went as poorly as it possibly could, just in an on-court basketball sense. Really everything about this trade was a misfire for Stu Jackson. It went badly on the court, and it was a really bad strategic decision. But it affected the history of the franchise in one major way. It completely messed up the 2003 draft for them. So you'll recall that I said that the pick was top 1 protected in 2003. So that meant that the Grizzlies had to win the draft lottery if they wanted their first round pick that year. Well, it just so happened that the now Memphis Grizzlies, still reeling from Stu Jackson's horrendous decision-making, although he had stepped down 2 years before, they really could have used that first round pick that year, whether it was number 1 or all the way down to number 5, because who was the obvious number 1 pick in the 2003 draft? It was LeBron James. And even if they didn't win the lottery, there was the diaper dandy Carmelo Anthony of the national champion Syracuse Orangemen. There was ACC Rookie of the Year Chris Bosh out of Georgia Tech. And then there was Conference USA Player of the Year and Defensive Player of the Year Dwayne Wade out of Marquette. So when the lottery balls went Memphis's way and they won the number 2 pick, which of course then had to go to Detroit, Jerry West, who was the general manager of the Memphis Grizzlies from 2002 to 2007, was left without the opportunity to pick a non-LeBron James superstar franchise player, all because of a bad trade that the person in charge 2 administrations before had made. So sometimes, that's just the way life works. Now, even if the Grizzlies had had the number 2 pick, they may still have picked Darko Milicic as the Pistons did, and Milicic, still may have turned into the player that he became. But regardless, Pau Gasol alongside Dwayne Wade or Carmelo Anthony would have been pretty sweet if you ask me. Now, I would like to see this, but I haven't. The new documentary, The Grizzly Truth, by Kat Jamie, who made Finding Big Country, also a great documentary. I haven't seen it, but from what I can surmise of it, it looks like a film pinning the blame on why the Grizzlies relocated to Memphis on both Michael Heisley, the owner who relocated the team, as well as Steve Francis, who, of course, refused to play for the Grizzlies when they picked him second overall in '99. And while, in my opinion, they do shoulder a lot of the blame, I think Steve Francis spurning the Grizzlies, it was less of the cause, maybe, and more like the cherry on top of the sundae. I really hope that she mentions the Otis Thorpe trade in that documentary because I can see the franchise being taken more seriously and not losing as much money as it did as quickly as it did if Otis Thorpe had stuck around and done what Stu Jackson, had hoped of him. Things really didn't start going badly until Otis Thorpe came around. So maybe that's something for the with the second pick Steve Francis podcast to continue, which, by the way, great pod, highly entertaining, very interesting. They give a different perspective on all things Vancouver Grizzlies than I do. So if you're interested in the Vancouver Grizzlies and you don't listen to that pod, you got to check them out. But anyway, yeah, I think that's going to be it for me. There was something else that I was wanting to talk about today, but I think I'm going to keep it as a separate episode and post that in a few days since my workload is pretty light for the time being. Pleased to announce that I finally finished my coding assignment from hell, which took me long enough, is all I got to say. 1,900 or so lines of SQL from scratch, all done. If you're a real data scientist, unlike me, that probably doesn't sound like a lot, but for me, that is about 10 times as much as I want to do, so I'm glad that's finally done. And I can finally say that it looks like we're going to get back to a more regular posting schedule for this show, but I'll let you know more about that once I'm sure about it. Probably will keep it bi-weekly for a little while just because of the holidays, but actually stick to posting on Thursdays like I'd originally planned. But yeah, we will talk again in a few days. I'm gonna make a short podcast episode about something basketball related that's come up recently, but I'd like to take a couple days to research it before I speak on it. But yeah, really appreciate you listening. Check out the website, backfirednba.com. Follow the socials at Backfired NBA Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And we will talk soon. All right. Have a good one. Baby, are you gonna be the one that saves me? And after all, you're my wonder wall.